Welcome to the Double Up Lineup Collab. I'm Shannon Hughes.
I'm Rachael Tilley.
And I'm Dave Prodan.
We're joining forces to celebrate the current state of women's surfing, along with the prior generations who have paved the way.
Well, guys, this is the first time that we are doing something like this, and I'm really excited. Obviously, all three of us are huge fans of women's surfing, so I'm looking forward to getting into the discussions all about the current present day women's surfing. We're seeing the progression, the absolute progression we just saw, even most recently in Abu Dhabi and Pipe. Obviously, all that coming from all the work and progression that came from all the women of the past day as well. And so I'm looking forward to chatting with both of you guys. I'm right now coming from, I'm in Queensland at the moment. We have been scoring on cyclone swell, but now we've reached the day that the cyclone is actually hitting us. So now it's kind of no more surfing and we're just like locking down. Everyone's preparing for going out of power and yeah, well, I guess we'll see from there if we get flooded or whatnot. Hopefully not.
Fingers crossed everything stays okay. I am coming in from Sydney. I live on the South Coast and we have no internet at home today. So I feel like we're experiencing like the touches of the cyclone up north, just with like really sunny, pleasant conditions down south. So I'm set up at my boss's house who runs a surf shop down the road. And thankfully they've got an empty house today. So we've got working internet. And we are locked in for a good conversation alongside Dave Prodan today.
That's right. And I'm coming from my home in Oxnard. We've had an interesting winter. It's been like super duper cold, so cold that my local beaches had orcas that have been taking seals off the beach.
Have you seen some?
It was pretty exciting. I have not, but my barber was like, my little guy, I got twins, 11-year-old twins, boy and a girl. And my little guy like wants to rip. So he's like, I want to be on a shortboard. And I'm like, please don't do that. Like, please just like, let's go longboarding. Like it's so much more pleasant. Anyway, and like a month or two ago, I took him out at, and was pushing him into waves. There's been seals like swimming around and stuff. It's fine. And then I got my hair cut the next day and my barber was like a really good surfer. And he's like, where you been surfing? And I was telling him, he's like, what about the orcas? And I'm like, the what? And he shows me this photo and I'll send it to you after this. But it's like the seal colony on the beach at Silver Strand. And you zoom in and there's one, I don't know, like 15 feet off the shoreline with a seal in its mouth. And then you zoom in like 20 feet south and there's another one like swimming like, and I'm like, whoa, all right. I'm definitely the slowest seal, but but yeah, so it's been an interesting surfing season for us over here in addition to the weather, but it has lent itself to us getting to watch like a ton of surfing, both on the beach and online. I was in Hawaii for a little bit, but then I got to watch the rest of the event on the broadcast and then got to watch the Abu Dhabi event, got to watch natural selection. And so, yeah, I'm stoked to be here with you guys and talk about surfing.
That is so wild. We had nothing to the stage of orcas by any means or anything that could really be maybe accidentally chomping off a leg in the lineup. But we had such a wild whale season, like through October and November here. It was the coolest thing, like just straight off of our beach. We had so many like southern right whales and humpback whales and everything just coming through. And they were all like had calves with them. And we just had this run of like maybe 6 weeks where there was like no whales one day, hadn't seen one. Next day, it was like, oh my God, I think I saw 20 whales today. Like, that's wild. And then it just lasted for like a month and a half. And it was so cool. Like anytime you'd be surfing, just like driving down the coast, they were everywhere and like breaching and spouts and stuff. So it was a pretty cool introduction to summer for us on this side of Australia.
Oh, that sounds really nice. And Rachael, you've just been scoring for days on the Queensland coast. So I'm really jealous.
Yeah, it has been an incredible run of waves for sure. Yesterday was kind of, I mean, Kira has been absolutely cooking, but I started up at Snapper and pretty much as soon as you paddle out at Snapper, like no one's catching waves out at Snapper. You're just like starting up there to drift down. And as soon as it got low tide later in the day, you'd duck dive maybe 3 waves and you'd already be almost in front of Kira. Like not even had made it out. So it was definitely like I came in, my arms were so exhausted by the end of the day. And then you're coming on the beach and running around. So I actually think I did a lot of paddling and then a lot of like running a lot of miles running up the beach. So I think I'm welcoming a day in, but the waves have been well worth it. So that's been fun.
Well, it's really exciting for us to be able to have this chat with you today, Dave. You guys reached out to us as a lineup, having the idea to collaborate with a few other surf podcasts around the world through this season, which is really fun. Rachael and I obviously run a women's-based surf podcast. We're completely obsessed with women surfing as female surfers ourselves. And so we found it to be a great opportunity to come in and chat about the progression of where women's surfing is currently sitting, like how totally undeniable that is, but also to be able to back that up with the fact that that progression's been happening since the 60s. And every decade or every 15 years, we see that progression continuing to improve. And we're just happen to be sitting in this real high time of that at the moment, which is really exciting. So thanks so much for, coming up with the idea for us to have this chat with you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. The lineup, it's like a fun project. It's not my job. It's a volunteer thing, but it's a really fun thing for me to get to talk about surfing outside my day job. But the Double Up's one of our favorite podcasts, and just getting to speak to other important voices in the community and exchange ideas and just geek out on surfing. This is my 20th year at the company, and it's someone like Steph Gilmore, I think won her first CT event my very first year, and so she and I have grown up together in a lot of ways. And I actually got my start on the global tour doing media for the international women's tour. So I was on the women's tour for a couple of years exclusively, and I'm not sort of talking up my bona fides here, but had a ton of respect for them before I got to go on tour. And it's one of those things where it's you watch the video parts, or you watch the webcasts, or you look at the photos in the magazine, and it still doesn't do justice how good they are. So being on tour and being exposed to that is such an impactful experience. And I was blown away 20 years ago when I started out on tour, and the level of progression that's happened in 2 decades is kind of mind-boggling to me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I actually think it's really interesting where you're even starting with that conversation of 20 years ago, you were on the women's tour, and even just that language in and of itself looks so different to today, because obviously the men's and women's tours are entirely combined, and we see the equal number of events, and the women are truly a part of the quote unquote dream tour that was established 30 years ago. And so I think even just in your time at the company from 20 years ago, how that looked to how your presence or anyone at the WSL's presence now with those tour combines naturally just looks so different.
For sure. It's funny you bring that up. I was talking to Lakey Peterson about this last week, and she was a rookie in 2012. And I looked up the schedule when she was a rookie, because it all bleeds together for me after a while. And the women's CT in 2012 was 7 events. It was the Gold Coast, Bells Beach, Taranaki in New Zealand, Sydney, Rio, Biarritz, and it finished at Huntington Beach. And it's such a wildly, all those venues are fantastic, but it's, as you pointed out, Rach, it's not like a dream tour. And, 2 years later, so the WSL ASP at the time, it got acquired at the end of 2012. 2013 was kind of a gap year. And then 2014 was the first new year of operations. And the women's tour 2 years later was 10 events. It was the Gold Coast, Margaret River, Bells Beach, Rio, Fiji, Huntington Beach, Lowers, Hossegor, Cascais, and it finished at Honolulu Bay. And I think it changed so quickly, but to your point, post-COVID, all the CT events are combined men's and women's, all the CS events are combined men's and women's. And I think there is that field of dreams component of if you build the platform, the performances are going to come. And it is amazing what happens when you give people an opportunity.
Yeah, it's been amazing to see that start to come into fruition now with those combined tours. The fact that, we're seeing that push from both sides. We're seeing women get the opportunity to surf and better surf now than in a consistent manner across an entire tour. I would argue that this is the first year the women are getting a dream tour, because they've had the spots that you just listed off, even from Lakey's early years, reflecting all the way back to like, through those kind of really early years, through the 70s or the 80s, even on tour, through the 90s and the early 2000s, where the women had these like flashes of a good wave. So they'd have a heavy wave on tour. And then that all got taken away. And it was like primarily beach break surfing. And the women rose to the occasion. They absolutely excelled in the type of surfing they needed to do at those breaks. But it wasn't by any means a dream tour. It was like kind of average QS waves in a lot of senses for what these women were surfing for the championship tour, for like trying to get world titles and stuff. And now to see how far it has come in that shift towards giving the women the opportunities to start a season at Pipe, to have, Tahiti on the calendar at Tehupo, to have, Fiji back on for finals, and have J-Bay, and know that the women hopefully will get actually good waves instead of like that old story from Rochelle Ballard of them refusing to paddle out because it was literally breaking like on the rocks and the girls didn't want to surf it because it was like unsurfable. I just feel like the tour has come so far in that sense, and it's allowed these women the opportunity to really start to rise to the occasion and push the progression of their surfing because of the waves that they're now able to actually compete in on a hopefully consistent basis for many years to come.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. Like everyone, their achievements because they stand on the shoulders of giants. I think like you note on Rachael, Kiala, Pam Burridge, Lane, Lee, like it goes, the list is endless, right? And the point on Pipe, I think, is the right point, right? Because it's probably the most dangerous and most revered wave on the planet, and we're only like a few years into thinking it could happen, right? Because in 2022, the women's tour was still starting in Honolulu Bay, and we had that horrifying shark attack where we had to cancel the rest of the event there and move the rest, I think is the quarters or the semis, move the end of the event to Pipe. And I remember being in those conversations, and I full credit to our commissioner, Jessie Miley Dyer. Like she was really in there, like not only prioritizing safety, but also like pushing for everyone to believe in what the women were capable of. That was less than 5 years ago. Right. And you look back at the Pipe event. Yeah. Right. Like you look back and we're going to have our 50th year of a world tour next year. Right. So it's like a tiny fraction of that. And then you look at the women performing last year from, Molly, Caity, Betty Lou, to the women performing this year in like serious Pipe. And it's the Overton window of what everyone expects has shifted so much in such a short period of time.
Yeah, it's amazing to think through. I think Rachel and I, we've had this conversation on the Double Up quite a lot. The thinking through like the Caity versus Molly heat at Pipe this year, or the kind of some of the back and forth that they've had over the last couple seasons, where I think it was the semifinals, right? Caity and Molly were matched up in for this year. Was like a just full barrel fest. And they were so tapped in, so locked into knowing exactly where to sit, so locked into actually having a read of the wave, putting themselves deeper into better and better positioning. And it's continuing to spark this conversation, this excitement around like women's surfing is the surfing that we want to be seeing right now. Men's surfing is amazing. It always, it's been there for so long, and so has women's, but it's the trajectory that women's is currently taking, and a heat like that between a Caity and a Molly is that evidence that we're just like frothing, like we can hardly stay in our seats watching it. That's from watching at home. That's not even being at the beach and getting able to like actually experience it. But yeah, Rach, like it's the opportunity for them to actually have those heats at those locations when the waves are actually good as well, that allows their performances to grow and to actually peak, which hasn't happened all that often. There's been plenty of these last couple of years where Pipe has run and the women haven't had the opportunity to surf on the good days because the men's tour, maybe because of the size of it or whatever, has just needed to take up a big day of surfing. And that's happened to be one of those bigger days, Rach.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, this convergence of like where opportunity to even just have those days needs to be presented. And then the women also need to be able to show up and, up that level. And I think that's been really encouraging and exciting to see from a spectator perspective, is every time that opportunity has been presented. And Shan, like the Caity Molly semifinal is a perfect example of that at Pipe this year. And then last year it was I know Betty Lou was part the semifinals that happened last year. Similar people, obviously, Caity, Betty Lou, Molly, and I'm trying to remember who else was in the semis.
Was it Brisa was in there in the semifinals last year? Yeah,
I think so. So, you know, seeing when those opportunities finally are presented, we see the women actually stepping up, and I think it comes into an interesting conversation of, and already I tend to tangent us a little bit, and so I'm already starting to tangent us, but you know, where I have this observation, I think that like once you're on tour, sometimes your surfing can tend to become stunted a bit because you start traveling, you know, for the surfers that have been on tour 10 plus years, your job is to try and win a world title. And in order to win that world title, you're trying to become the best at the 8 to 11 spots listed for that year. And so when the women have a tour that, let's say, aren't at Pipe, isn't at Chopu, isn't at Fiji, whatever, their focus, their job is to be the best at the Portugal, at Bells, at Margaret, and all of those. And those are fantastic venues as well. But to have a well-rounded tour is really essential. And I think pushing women's surfing to continue to be more well-rounded too, from a competition perspective. Because when we see, and I think we do see a lot of these, the women on the CT as those mastheads of the head of progression of women's surfing, you know, and that's what we've looked to that for a long time. And, you know, to now finally see them at these locations where prior to, if they're focused on all of that, they don't have time to be spending, you know, spending time on the North Shore if they're finishing at the US Open at the end of their season, you know, like we talked about in 2012 or whatever. So now that they are forced to be able to spend these times in these places, it creates like a well-balanced, where there's opportunity, where there's, you know, they can actually rise to the occasion. And so I think the tour schedule in its change up so much recently has been really essential and a huge aid to women evolving and progressing in their surfing.
I think it's a really good point. It's something we talk about in my day job from like a tour design perspective too, because I think it's not just like the CT venues that are elevating because of the venue opportunity, but we have a lot of work to do on our Challenger series too. Like we're very fortunate that we have, you know, the events we have at the venues we have them at. But to your point, Rachael, like if there's a huge discrepancy in the types of waves that are matriculating the rookies and the next generation of surfers, men and women, to the CT, if there's a huge discrepancy between those events and the ones on the CT, they're not going to come in prepared. So that's something that we're working on a lot. But like, Rachael, I want to get your take too, because Shannon and I are very fortunate because we have you as the youngest world champion in the history of the sport and someone who's an elite surfer in their own right. You know, when you look at the women on tour today, you know, your Caitys and your Mollys and your Carolines performing at places like Pipe, performing at places like Teahupo'o, do you think there is something, how do I put this? Like, is there something like physically with this generation of surfers or talent wise with this generation of surfers that is maybe unique compared to prior generations? I guess another way to put it is if we had put, you know, Pipe and Teahupo'o on tour 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, do you think that we would have seen similar performances, or is there something special about this current crop of women?
That is a great question. And I'll try and formulate my answer to that as I think out loud. But, you know, I mean, Teahupo'o, we've seen that on tour before, and we've seen fantastic performances in the mid 2000s, you know, specifically like Keala Kennelly and those surfers of that generation. I don't think it's something physically of, you know, this new generation. I think we've already lended to it before, is like the surfing that we're seeing now is because of all the levels of and stages of surfing that have continued to evolve from generation to generation. I think there is, and I was thinking of like bringing this up later in our conversation, but it's happening now. So here we are.
Let's go with it.
Let's go.
Yeah, I think there is a change in the way we embrace and support women surfing from just like a verbal media perspective, how our society has evolved to and embraced women surfing, that and I think I'll speak to this, and sorry, I'm jumping around. I'll speak to this from actually my own experience in the longboarding world too, because I think this happened actually a couple of generations before, like, earlier than it's happened on the shortboard side. But, growing up, the biggest compliment you could get was that you're just trying to surf like a guy. As a girl surfer, you're just trying to surf like a guy. And that's the biggest, if they say like, wow, I thought you were a guy out there, and you're like, wow, really? That's awesome. And I think we've finally gotten to a point where like surfing, it doesn't have to be a comparison. Women's surfing stands on its own. And I want to surf like the great women surfers. I appreciate men's surfing. It is phenomenal. It's so entertaining, and I respect it so much. Just as I respect women surfing, and it stands on its own as a separate entity. And I think when you see surfers like Caity specifically, I think she's a great example of this. Her surfing looks so lively, loose, and fresh. And I think it's because and Steph has been a great example of this, and Pat in the previous generation, is that they have fully embraced this might sound like foo-foo to say, but like their feminine energy and like the qualities and strengths that they have as a woman. And they've brought that into their surfing rather than just trying to like send that to the side and just surf like a guy. And I think we've had that on the longboarding side. And sorry to kind of go on this monologue, but in my own experience, like that's all we were trying to do. And obviously there's a big power difference from men to women, I guess, whatever board that you're on. But on the longboarding side, it can be even more prevalent because we have large boards and
surfboards.
The longboard world went into a very progressive state in the early 2000s. It went extremely progressive. It was, you're just basically whipping around this giant board like a shortboard, and women weren't doing that in the same way that men could overpower and do that. And so women had to kind of fork away from men's longboarding and embrace our own in the style, flow, and grace of what the sport does. And we've converged back together in terms of the criterion where longboarding is at now. But I think that had forced me, I think I actually had a specific conversation after I got, I almost won my second world title in 2018, but I finished second. And after that, and kind of rehashing out how do I want my surfing to evolve and continue to progress forward? And I was like, I'm done trying to just surf like Taylor Jensen or Ben Skinner or all those guys. They are 3 times my size. I want to be looking at my favorite female surfers and competitors, Honolulu Bloomfield, Kalia Moniz, Megan Godinez, like those surfers, and take and pull inspiration from them and bring that. And after I did that, I became a wildly better surfer. And so that's all to bring me onto my point, is that I think the women now, the Caitys, the Mollys, all the newer, younger generation, Vahine, they're all able to look at all the work that Steph, Carissa, Lakey, Tyler have all just put in, and they were able to grow up with that inspiration and try and be like them. And so therefore they were able to lean into that, and they're becoming the surfers that they are now. So long-winded point, but
no, I think that's so well said, right? And I think that what I was hearing from you break that down, Rachael, is something I think about a lot, where it really does pertain to like style. And you often hear like really like high surf IQ people breaking down the true greats. And they often use a phrase that's always stuck out to me, which is like, that person just drew different lines on the wave, and to me, that speaks to like a self-confidence and an individuality, right? Like whether it's like a Lisa or a Steph or an Andy or a Joel, it's like they weren't trying necessarily to surf like anyone else. They weren't trying to surf like, they were trying to surf like them, And I think hearing you talk about it too, it's like, I'm not trying, like, what you're right. Like when longboarders were trying to surf longboards like shortboards, it didn't really work. Right. And when, elite level surfers are trying to surf like somebody else, it speaks to like maybe some gaps in their own security in a way. But the true greats, your Rachel Tilley's, your Steph Gilmore's, your Caity Simmers they approach a wave and they draw different lines. And that really stands out, especially at like the bleeding edge of surfing. It's really interesting to hear you break that down.
Yeah, I think there's a point too, and women have been behind the curve on this just because of where we've stood in the media and the society takeaway from it. But young boys have always been encouraged to find that creativity within themselves because it seems like it's inherent in them. And then girls have always been encouraged to do what they're doing. And now we're at a point where it's encouraging the way media and we embrace women surfing and uplift it and talk about it as worthy enough in and of itself, I think encourages the younger generations and young girls now to embrace and have that confidence to be able to do exactly what you're saying. Because I 100% agree. It's a confidence to know like, hey, how I read a wave is unique and interesting enough. It's not trying to just, replicate something and do it slightly worse than because it's not your own. And I think Caity's a perfect example of coming onto tour with such a bang. I mean, even in the way that she took her year off when she first qualified and was like, no, I want to keep investing into my surfing and what I'm doing. And she wasn't at that space. And then to be able to embrace the competition side of it once she was ready to do so, completely shows the own path that she's bold enough to take.
I think also just to kind of tag on in that that specific conversation is like how awesome it is to see those surfers that do take their own approach to a wave. And I feel like Abu Dhabi was a really, like, as much as I am not a huge fan of watching a wave pool contest, we know the surfing community has been up in arms about those since like, day dot of them existing. The fact that a wave like that is like, it's an absolute replica, wave after wave after wave, you're seeing the same thing, bar a bit of a wind change. And to see the way that Gabby, Brian, and Caity Simmers approached that wave was wildly different from each other. But they're both actually pushing the progression of women surfing in the way that they were doing that. And I think that's like so cool to see, in that conversation of them being a bit younger. Obviously, Caity's newer to the tour than Gabby is, but Gabby's still a very fresh face and she's just finding her way within that space. She had a couple years on that pack just underneath her. But the power that Gabby is bringing into that, and even like thinking through, I've got a couple of waves, like one or two of her waves that are just playing through my mind right now, which is probably why I'm struggling to talk about them because I'm watching them. Sure. Where she is almost like avoiding the barrel sections a bit because she wants to get so deep on her bottom turn so she can come so hard off the top and throw so much more spray than what any of the other women were doing in that competition. So her approach was in that power space of really pushing things and feeling like she has worked out that this is her strength. She's got some things she's going to round out within her surfing, but like she's going to allow her approach to really show forth on that wave, where Caity's obviously coming out and like adding in insane amounts of variety, roundhouse cutbacks that like nobody's like, no man or woman is trying on the outside section. She's like tying together so many things with such perfect flow and high performance within that. I think it's a perfect example of how both of them are being raised in a generation now where women's surfing is being celebrated as its own thing, and we can celebrate it the same that we're celebrating women's sport as women's sport and not women's sport in comparison to men's sport across any different sport that's being played. And the two of them are taking that approach in their own unique manner, but they're both doing it in like incredible ways that really showcases who they are.
It's such a great point. Like I love that you bring up Gabby Bryant. We sort of like, adopted her as a lineup unofficial team rider just because we're such big fans of the way she approaches surfing. And
she's the kindest person that's ever existed.
She's so sweet.
And she's such a good surfer, but like particularly at the Abu Dhabi wave, like she really, like early on at the Lemoore facility, and for the few of us that have been there and the few of us that have gotten like a handful of waves, like, and all the surfers, like whether they're like elite level CT surfers or just, people that have that kind of coin and end up there, it's like they they go so much pressure, like I'm surfing conservatively because I don't want to mess it up. And it's like, it's this pressure cooker kind of situation. And I remember early on in Lemoore, I was up there for work, and like we were talking about the best people that had been to the tub so far. And Kelly was like, Sonny Garcia is like one of the best people I've ever seen here. And he shows us this video, and we're talking about it. And it was like, Sonny obviously is like a famed power surfer, but what he kind of did there that looks so different was he had like a healthy, what I'd call disrespect for the wave. Like he was not intimidated at all. Like where everyone's like, I don't want to screw this section up. Yeah. He's like, this is a 3-foot wave and I'm going to blast my back foot through it. Like every section. And that reminds me so much of Gabby. Like she's just full throttle and just really leaning into her strengths. It's a cool thing to see. And, you know, Shannon, you're an elite surfer in your own right, but you're also one of the like most celebrated surf intellectuals on the planet. And you've seen so much change happen in surf media as well. And Rachael was kind of touching on it. I'm curious to get your take on like, obviously media landscapes change so much for like across the planet. Certainly in surfing, there's been so much of what I would call like player empowerment or surfer empowerment, where they've kind of a lot of times out of necessity had to become media empires unto themselves. They're like, I'm going to film, I'm going to put up my own content. Yeah. I'm going to own my narrative. Like, what do you think of all that? And I guess like what the role of like media in particular, like, you know, both your voices on the double up is supposed to be doing in surfing in 2025?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Like straight off the bat, out of my mind comes other media organizations that are working to push women's sport forward, like Female Athlete Project, which runs out of Australia. The Gist covers so much good content, and it's really kind of an equal balance between women's sport and celebrating both men's and women's, but putting a heavy focus into that. And I think the more that we can do as the media to talk about women's sport in our context of the double up, to talk about women's surfing on like the regular basis, whether it's weekly, it's every 2 weeks, it's once a month, whatever the conversation is, that we're putting it out there as current news, it's becoming current news. So the more that we put that focus on women's surfing being the current news, the more that the audience members, people around the world that care about surfing are going to be like, oh, right, we've got to also be thinking about women's, and actually maybe now even like, oh, I've got to care about men's surfing as well, and I'm going to watch a little bit of it. But the women's, it's where it's at, and that's what I want to pay attention to. And that's so much of what Rachael and I have come into with our idea of kicking off the double up a few years back, was like, we are huge surf fans. We watch a ton. Like you said, you know, Rachel's now a 2-time world champion. She's actively competing still. We're both working behind the scenes within the industry. I'm getting to commentate on so many cool events and just like witness the progression and the excitement of some of these different generations too, a little bit like not quite as far back as you, Dave, but from about 12 years ago is kind of where my foot got in the door in that space. And I feel like the more that we're able to bring into that conversation what's happening in women's surfing, and Rachael and I have, even from the start of this project that we're working on with the double up, we started with going, okay, we're going to chat about the CT because that's the kind of, you know, that's the biggest deal, right? But we're also going to make sure that we are picking up on those young QS surfers, that we're getting to those surfers that are maybe of an older generation, but they have been slogging away and they've just never quite cracked the tour. Like we're going to give enough airtime to trying to get into, and for ourselves, even educating ourselves on who those women are, who those young girls are, who that next generation is, as well as those that have come so much like before us, you know, like those other world champions, like a Pam Burridge or a Pauline Mensah, like getting into those conversations so that those names and those women and their surfing is the current news of what's happening in surfing. And it's not just that John's staying on tour or he's retiring and nobody knows what's happening, or, you know, Jack Robinson's in this position and things, or Baron Mamiya's kind of wiring the way that barrels are ridden at pipe. Like those are awesome things, but we want that same conversation to be happening in women's surfing. And I think the more and more that media takes on that onus, that it's our responsibility to put that out there, it's going to mean that more of those clips, more of those girls that are out there with their mom or dad filming on the beach and they're putting their little own edit together, whether it's like as sharp and cool as what Caity Simmers does in her own editing world of Toasted, versus just someone that's like, hey, I just need to put some clips up because hopefully a sponsor will see this and someone will throw me a little bit of money so I can afford to get to the next qualifying event. Any of that space that we can kind of then come in and back up is going to give them hopefully even more confidence to continue putting that content out, because we're going to talk about it. It's going to give us more interest in their developing story as well as they walk on their road to hopefully becoming a world champion one day.
It makes sense. I mean, I think surfing, like compared to other sports, it suffers, and this is something I spend way too much time dealing with and thinking about, but like it suffers from like a relative lack of a center of gravity, right? Like in basketball, it's like the NBA is like the center of gravity. In football, it's the NFL, right? And in surfing, and since time immemorial and forever in the future, like the center of gravity is not just going to be the WSL or the CT or the QS. Like there's all these different places to like effectively express surfing and beautifully express surfing. But that creates like a real like public discourse challenge, right? Because it's like, well then what's important, right? Like what are we supposed to focus on? What can we talk about week in and week out? And, you know, and when I was a kid coming up before I joined, like during the, you know, the Andy Kelly wars, like I was team Andy. As a fan, like I didn't like discern between like watching Andy in Snap 2 or Trilogy or watching Andy beat Kelly's brains in Japan. It was all one thing to me, you know? So like you talking about what Caity's doing in Toasted and then what she's doing on the CT, I think like it, like, I think when things, they are respectful of like their purpose and their role and their identity in this broader, beautiful ecosystem of surfing, it becomes a lot easier to talk about. But I'm with you guys, like the more regularly you can talk about it, the better. And the more stable that pathway is in terms of like, well, for young surfers coming up, like, do they even know what the schedule looks like in 2027? No, I know that because I'm working on it. You know what I mean? But it's like, how do we establish something that's going to be like a 5, a 10-year, like kind of just like guardrails in terms of what surfing can be for people that want to invest in it.
I think too, and then Rach, if you've got any thoughts, you can tag on to this, but I think within that, like from the media perspective, there's also there's so many different ways that people and young surfers are going to grow up to then join the surf community, whether it's that they're on a great track and they are those really, I mean, the handful of kids that are going to ever actually crack onto the CT and make something of them, crack onto the World Longboard Tour and battle for world titles, make it in the big wave world enough to actually put their name down like a Justine DuPont as like the greatest of all time in that space. There's a fair few surfers who are going to make it in that elite level of athleticism to actually compete like that. That said, there are so many other roles behind the scenes within surfing that allow space and opportunity to be poured into, whether it's from being involved in the broadcast. Like I am a strong believer. We've been working on this really hard with the ISA, and we're kind of just getting to that space where we want to have equal numbers. Like I want to listen to women talk about surfing just as I want to listen to men. I want to hear former world champs from the women's side just as much as those former world champs from the men's side. And I think that's something that is then also going to set the standard for those young up and coming girls who I get messages from that are like, I want to be a commentator one day. What do I do? Like, do I just start jumping on the mic at Board Writers? I'm like, yeah, that's literally exactly how you start. Just like figure it out, figure if you like talking about surfing and take it from there. Like you can work your way kind of into the scene while also working on your own surfing and everything. And I think there's such a missing link that's currently happening within the surfing like community or whatever, of there being a single voice that we get to hear from the women's side, typically with somebody on sidelines, but really like if we're listening to Flick at an event, it's the best thing ever. I want to hear her break things down. Yeah. Let's put a couple more women on that panel and make sure those numbers are equal. Let's do those kind of things so that those women that are coming up are seeing themselves modeled so that they know they can aspire to be that. Because when I was growing up, there was like Rosie and that was it. And Rosie was awesome. And I legitimately was like, I will never, ever have a place in that world because there's a space for one woman only, and that woman's already established. There's just, I didn't even know that I could dream to think that way. And so I think once you start to see broader representation, that's going to increase the dreams of those young girls that are coming up to want to fill in those roles. We're seeing the same thing as numbers are increased. The ISA, the Olympics have equal numbers of surfers across their events, right? Which is incredible. The WSL, thankfully, is starting to get into that conversation with the increased numbers coming next year. Coolest thing ever. Now more women know that they have a chance of making the CT because there's literally more surfers that are going to make the CT. Hopefully one day we see that into equal numbers as well, where that improvement can come, and even more women will go, okay, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and I'm going to really try and make it within this. Same goes for those jobs and those industry, roles kind of behind the scenes, whether it's those CEO positions, like whatever it is. The more that women are filling those out now who have earned their position there, the more that young women are going to aspire to fill those out. And we're going to see so much more progression in women surfing, not just in the context of wave riding, but when it comes to the entire industry.
I have a couple points to piggyback off that, Shan. And from that same perspective that you had felt from the commentary perspective, I was like, there's that one spot and it's full. That was how sponsorship was as a girl longboarder my entire time growing up. It was like, all right, each team or each endemic brand seemed to have their like one token female longboarder. And you're like, okay. And if they already have it, like they're not looking, and I was super fortunate to have Hurley invest in me from a young age and like lock down that support. And then it turned, I'm looking at other extremely talented, future world champions or potential world champions who are just struggling to get that support. And so that goes into our conversations too, Shan, and even this one now is the more we're talking about and making things. And I think it's that back and forth. And I love like challenging my own, I guess, thoughts in this is like, brands are business. Like they're not a charity. And I think that's something I keep going back to. They're not there to just like invest in something that's not going to give them return. They need to sell bathing suits, board shorts, t-shirts, whatever it is. And I'm super cognizant of that. And so therefore, I think on the flip side, it is the responsibility of the media and the lead organizations, WSL just being only one of them. There's multiple that I think the responsibility lies on to make shortboarding, longboarding, big wave, men's, women's surfing, the power's there for us to make that current news and worthy. And therefore the endemic brands tend to follow where that focus is on and that ROI is. And then that's where you see, the investment put in. And so the more women's surfing has been put on this platform and those opportunities for incredible surfing to be had, now the more we're seeing that poured back into them, at not just the top levels, but going down in levels of Challenger Series, QS, and the youth. I think we're seeing that distribution happen to a lot lower level of not surfing, but like of generation of youth than we saw beforehand.
It's a really good point. And I think what I liked about what both you and Rachael said was there's a piece of like making it feel real and like the ROI piece. Like I'll tell you a story from when I started. Like it was like 10 of us that worked at the ASP. I think there were 5 by the time we got acquired. And like my job in media was like write press releases, do like deals with the magazines, like build a website, everything. Right. And I said, okay, like, and so the website piece for me, we didn't have any of the media rights. So what we did have, we were like, okay, well, we can be a hub. Like if there's 12 events, instead of someone having to memorize like 12 different websites, they can just come to aspworldtour.com and we can send them where they need to go. So we started running like Google Analytics for the site. And I would give them to my counterparts at like Billabong and Quicksilver and Hurley and say like, hey, good job. You guys are up like 15% year over year. And my counterparts, like to a person, would come to me and say, this is great information. My boss doesn't give a shit at all. All they say is, what did Quicksilver do? We're going to do that plus this. What did Billabong do? We're going to do that plus this. And it was what my friend Renato Hickel calls like the fat cow times. Like everyone was making so much money. There was no interest in understanding, like, why are we paying this surfer that much money? Why are we investing that much in a CT? And I say that from the ASP's perspective, but it's from the surfer's perspective. It's from the journalist perspective. Mm-hmm. And now that we're trying to make everything real, there's a ton of people that are responding from the surfing community that have been around for a long time. They're like, well, I liked it the way it was. It's like, but that wasn't real, you know? And I get that like change can be scary, but like, you shouldn't sit there and say that all worked before. I liked it the way it was before. It's like, but it didn't. Right. Like we're going to try to build something that is like impactful and meaningful. And the way I look at it is like people like to put the business side over here and the surfing side over here. And I always say like, look, what is good for the business is good for surfing. And what's good for surfing is good for the business. Like that's the only way we succeed. And I think of that when we talk about like men's and women's surfing as well. It's not tokenistic. We're not doing it because it feels good. It is the right thing, but the way it's going to sustain is we do it in a way that makes business sense. And that's not something that can be taken away at the end of the day. And I think you guys are hitting on the same exact point, which I think's right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like giving, we have the opportunity here to help be one of those pieces of businesses getting their return on investment into these surfers by giving the surfers platform and talking about them, talking to them, creating more discussion and news and hype around them, promoting and their edits happening at all levels. And I think going back to a point that you were talking about, Dave, was there's no center of gravity, and like WSL can be a piece of that. But, also looking at most recently natural selection, I think is, another piece of the puzzle that's just contributing and adding to that. And, to see the surfers that were invited to that. I mean, Shannon and I have already discussed it. I think there's no reason why that right out of the gates, being such a small field, could have been equal numbers. But the surfing and opportunities that we see there, that women are included at the very least, like that's where it's awesome to be at a position now where we're having discussions of demanding equal numbers, because 10 years ago we're just saying like we would just love to see women included in that,
Right.
So, and I think sometimes there can be the criticism of like, oh, well, you're never satisfied. There's always something. But it is kind of those uncomfortable conversations to keep like trying to knock down the door and see that progression that we have to keep having. But on the positive side of what natural selection did, it's taking women into and men's and taking them into awesome surf and creating really cool, different consumable content around that.
I totally agree. And I mean, I think you're right on that tension piece, right? Because like all data, you got to look at it a little bit with some scrutiny, right? But like, I think 3 or 4 years ago, SEMA did a study and like the global surfing population was like 9 men to every 1 woman, right? Now, whether that's true or not, like there's a pretty big discrepancy. And then you look at something like the CT and it's like, well, that's already course correcting at 2 to 1. So it's quite a big investment in terms of like, to Shannon's point, like giving people a target and saying, no, we're going to invest in this. And I think that's redounded to like generations en masse, like stepping up their game. And now we're in a position where we can increase those numbers. And I think your point on natural selection is exactly right. Like it's just another very, very cool forum. And they're not the only ones. Like you can look at like the Eddie, you can look at the Pipe Masters, you can look at Stab High. It's like 20 years ago, it wasn't really a conversation that some of these specialty events would have women in it. And now it's not a conversation that they won't, which I think is a fantastic turn of events.
Yeah, it's incredible to see so many different opportunities. And it's also tapping into more surfers with different strengths in their backgrounds. Like it's no longer like you're talking about, that kind of that era of the ASP where it wasn't actually really realistic at all, but there was just so much money being made in a very specific realm of surfing, which was the shortboard. Sure. Outside of that now, we can see, and that's, that's even funny because it's like that was a huge change to what surfing even was when it just began, like planks of wood, turned
Yeah.
into long boards, turned into some good nose riding. Eventually, like, you know, that board shortened and shortened into like what surfing is today, which isn't surfing. It's just part of what surfing is. There's many aspects to what surfing is and the types of equipment that's been being ridden. But it's really cool to think of some of those events that you just named, like, you know, those big wave events, like a Pipe Masters event, like Red Bull Magnitude, which is pouring heaps into what women's big wave surfing is doing. And it's giving a lot of those surfers, I think, too, and Rach and I have been having a little bit more of this chat around, for us personally on the Double Up, wanting to get more free surfers into the conversation than just the competitive surfers that we've kind of been focusing on across all the different tours. Because they're getting those opportunities. Like a Red Bull Magnitude really gives opportunity to women who have no sponsorship or have very little. They're not professional surfers in that sense. They're free surfers who have an absolute love for big wave surfing and they want to continue to push and challenge themselves, likely on their own bill, rather than it being like fronted for them by somebody else. And so it's cool to see that there is opportunities like that developing, and opportunities just for free surfers in general, like a Jaleesa Vincent, Water Woman, Annie Reichert. We just did an interview with her. It dropped like a week or two ago. Really being able to forge some pathways as free surfers, even though they're in kind of different categories of what surfing is. And that's something that feels relatively fresh within the women's surfing conversation that was really predominant in men's surfing for so many years. Like the progression, again, of where women's surfing is heading across all these different aspects of it is just growing and growing in strength.
Yeah. And I think that dovetails in really nicely to what you guys were saying about like the player / surfer empowerment era in terms of media and independent media, like the Double Up. Like, you know, 20 years ago, it was a gatekeeper culture, right? Like the brands are paying the few magazine outlets. And I'm not even kind of criticizing that. Like, I think it functioned in ways that surprised a lot of people, but there wasn't like a freedom of movement for someone to go out there and earn their space, right? And someone to take control of their narrative, or someone to earn time and space in the minds of, you know, Shannon, Hughes, and Rachael Tilley, right? Like, it didn't really exist. And so I think that's why you are seeing like pockets of personality and pockets of performance like sprout up everywhere, you know? And I we were talking before we recorded, but like, I think all of it is related to, and with no disrespect to the men on the championship tour this year, I think Caity Simmers is the most important surfer in the world right now, certainly from a WSL perspective. And that's something we talk about on the lineup a lot. Like, I think from a talent perspective, I think from a stylistic perspective, I think from a personality perspective, she might be the most influential surfer on the planet. And I don't know, again, with respect to everyone that came before on both sides, like, I don't know if I can say that about another woman in the past. It's from my, you know, personal opinion. I just think it's like a remarkable turn of events, really, in a lot of ways.
I think like an interesting and good point too. Obviously, I think rivalry has a really important part of the whole play as well, being you know, even just the rivalry that we're seeing between Caity and Molly at the last two events and how that progresses each other. And we'll see if that continues to evolve potentially into something like a Andy and Kelly situation. I don't think we're seeing that stand up as much on the men's tour right now. We have a lot of incredible surfing, but we don't have that masthead rivalry that was like really exciting back in the day on the men's side. And so
everyone's meditating preheat together and holding hands rather than slicing throats.
So to see that like starting to make way on the women's tour, I think is really important, creates a lot of discussion, lends exactly into your point that you were just saying, Dave. And every surfer they're kind of only as good as they're pushed, you know? And so to see a lot of fresh faces all coming together right now, really excited to push each other, and they're friends on the beach, but they're like really competitive and excited in the water. You can see that reflect in their surfing, and it makes it, you know, surfing from a from an organizational like WSL perspective, like it's a form of entertainment to the spectators, right? And you have like your core surfers such as us that I love sitting and actually dissecting, well, the fundamentals of every person's ride, or, you know, how they're choosing the lines that they're choosing to take and stuff. But for the broader spectator, it's a form of entertainment. And the fact that that entertainment is starting to really continue to come, not just from Caity, but from the rivalries that are being created out of that, and what they're creating together. Like it's all on them, you know, Caity and Molly, like what they did, that's them. And it's really, I'm loving seeing it.
It's such a good point. And Shannon, I want to get your take on this too, because this came up for me a few weeks ago, and it was, you know, for 15 years on tour, the women had 3 world champions, Steph, Carissa, and Tyler. And then in 2023, Caroline Marks, she wins her first world title. You know, Caroline's 23. You know, last year, Caity Simmers, she wins her first world title. She's 19. And you've got rookies this year in, you know, Vahine's 25, Aaron's 17. They've already won CTs, and everyone's talking about it. Like it is like the potency on the women's tour right now. And I can't remember the exact stat, but it's like the amount of women who make up the top 17 right now who have actually won CT events is like 77%. It's before. Crazy.
Yes.
Yeah. Go please. Cause you'll know it better than I will.
No, I mean, I don't know the stat off the top of my head, but I get in these really deep conversations with my dad and brother about this. But in terms of mid-season cut and all of that, and you know, the defending of the mid-season cut is like, if the tour is there to crown a world champion, if you're not above the halfway point on the second half of it, you're not in contention for running a world title. And so anyways, I know in pro of mid-season cut, there's a lot of conversation around there. That's not for me to go down that path, but
don't make yourself a target, Rachael.
I know. On the women's tour though, as compared to the men's tour, we were going back and forth on like what percentage of the tour is made up of people who are winning events. And last year, I think there were 14 out of the top 18 that had won a CT at least some point in their career. And that's a wider base than we're seeing on the men's tour side. And that's what's making it like, you know, it doesn't just become the same 4 people, the same 8 people in the quarterfinals. Right. It's making for really interesting discussions and change ups in rankings. And that's what's exciting. And that's also, I think, proof in and of itself for the women's tour to continue to increase in numbers when you're seeing that level of quality talent that spread across 18 women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like I was just having a look through some of the notes that we jotted down. We'd kind of had we'd had a lot of kind of chunks of different things that we could take our audience through even, and like where our discussion might go today. But thinking of like those jumps for where we're currently at with like a Caroline having won the world title, like you said, Dave, backed up now by Caity winning the world title. That's a big shift from those 3 who were holding it down for so long, Steph, Carissa, Tyler. Prior to that, we've seen these shifts before, like Lisa going on her run and then that handoff to Lane, and Lane going on her run and that handoff to Steph, and Steph going on kind of her run that then got a little bit jumbled up between Carissa and Tyler as well. Like there have been those big shifts in previous generations, and I think those we can't forget about in the context to where we're currently at, because now it feels like a lot of that momentum that would go behind a couple of surfers, we're going to maybe see that happen here, but also that level of, based on the waves that are on tour, based on the support behind these women and them getting to actually just be themselves. Like these young women that are coming into the tour now, I know this is a little bit of tangent as well, a Caity, an Erin Brooks, etc., a Coco Milla Brown who's coming up, a Sierra Kerr, they're getting flown to go on surf trips to actually surf. They're not getting flown to go to surf destinations to go on bikini shoots, which is what an Isabella Nichols dealt with, who's a current member of that pack on tour, but is, you know, say 10 years ahead of where Erin Brooks is at within her career and her age. Like there's so many surfers in those previous generations that just didn't have that opportunity to actually develop their surfing outside of where they were at on tour and actually putting a jersey on. And now we're getting to see these young women coming forward, progressing their surfing when it comes to a conversation about the future. And I think that's going to be a really interesting like, I don't even know that I have an opinion necessarily formed yet on like, is Caity going to run away with this for good? Is she going to get 5 world titles in a row? I could certainly see it from a, like that personal approach to wave riding that she has that lends it to being just so exciting every time we see her stand up. But when it comes to Amali in that conversation and Aaron coming through and so many of the others that are going to continue battling and replacing some of that leave a message era that are the current tour members that have been like holding down their space for so long, you know, like Sally Fitzgibbon's still on tour, Lakey Peterson, Tatiana Weston Webb, who have been on the brink of world titles and just haven't quite gotten there. It's going to be really interesting to see, I guess, how that next generation brings a shift. Are we going to see one person run away with it? Are we going to see it split apart between multiple of these young up and coming women?
I'm glad you brought up Sally too, because I think that's another huge difference between the men's and women's tours in 2025. Because I look at someone like a Sally Fitzgibbons or a Joanne Defay or a Tatiana Weston Webb, a Lakey Peterson or a Tyler Wright, who are all around like their 30s. And I think they're surfing better than they ever have at any point in their career today. Right. And as Rachael said, like they're all surfers that have won CTs. They're all surfers that have been in title hunts. So I think that's a huge difference. You do have this amazing younger generation on the women's tour that's pushing into winning CTs. It's pushing into winning world titles. But I don't really think from a performance standpoint, they're pushing the veteran generation out. I think it's the opposite. I think you have this like really potent mix of surfers on tour right now where it's like if Sally Fitzgibbons went on a run and won the next 5 events, I would not be surprised because she surfs that well. You know what I mean? And it's not like you know, sometimes you have those years where men and women, you're like, yeah, that surfer's kind of just hanging on. No one is just hanging on the women's tour. And I think that's really rare.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, to kind of connect where we started this conversation or somewhere towards the beginning, Dave, when you were asking, do I think it's because this younger generation's coming off with such a bang? Is there something like, what's the difference? And I think to connect that to your point, Shannon, just now, is these young girls from a young age are getting flown out on trips or investing themselves or however they're making do. The priority is to go and surf and to learn about waves all around the world. And so they're coming onto tour with a lot deeper and richer international experience in the water and wave reading. And that is now coincided with a tour that actually, you know, promotes that and gives that opportunity for those skills to be uplifted. And so as opposed to, I think, you know, like you were saying, Isabella or Tati, you know, what, you know, potentially their early formative teenage years, how that looked informing their, you know, wave reading knowledge and stuff. Obviously, they are world title contenders, so it's not taking away from their surfing, but talking just about the bang that these 16, 17-year-olds are already coming onto tour with, and how they're already starting to win CTs on a tour that is arguably the most challenging and best tour that, you know, is being presented now. So I think that's a complete testament to the experience that they're getting through their teenage years right now.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. I think that, you know, thinking back to the 2022 rookie class kind of being that tipping point for leading into where this current generation is at now, to seeing the younger women on tour holding those world titles, is the evidence that that generation has really arrived. Not that they're just even making it onto tour and maybe not making the mid-season cut or something like that and struggling to kind of find their way and find their voice. The fact that we're holding on to world titles between Caity and Caroline as the back-to-back years, even Caroline having taken out, you know, the gold medal at the Olympics, as opposed to Carissa only 3 years ago because of the pandemic and everything with the Tokyo gold medal. Like, that shift is a big shift in the women's surfing conversation, because you could have even seen any one of that. You know, you could have easily seen Joanne Defay walking away the gold medalist in Tahiti this year, which would have been incredible for her career. But instead it went to that slightly younger, that kind of leader of that next generation in a Caroline Marks. Yeah, I don't know. I guess in whole with where we've kind of come and gone within this conversation so far, which has really tapped into quite a big variety of, the current tour, the past, our role within that, where the organizations, where the media lends a hand in continuing to progress things. I think that all in all, I feel I think I've had a lot of reservations in the past about where women's surfing is heading, not in the women's surfing itself, but just in, is there a support system built
like as a career?
Totally.
Right.
Is a career as a female surfer a smart decision? At
Sure.
this stage, I'm going, there's so much opportunity. And there's so much ahead for these young girls like a Tia Zabrowski, like a Sierra Kerr, Coco Milla Brown, Milla Coco Brown, like that pack to come up as the next generation. I'm like, the next kid at Board Riders down the road at Sandon Point, like our Grom girls are growing exponentially, as well as our kind of, my pack of the 30s to 40s that are just out there to have fun, and hopefully we get a really good wave and we don't make too much of a fool of ourselves. All of these like packs of women are growing in the amounts of surfers that are in the lineup. And I think so much of that is because this excitement that's coming from the top and the trickle down effect is so genuine, it's so real, and how it hits not just in that competitive space, but how it really filters all the way down to just like your grassroots movements of surfing. And I think the future for women's surfing is very bright for where it stands.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, I think that you think of it from a few perspectives. Like there's more people globally that are surfing than ever before. There's more people engaging with surf content than there ever has been before, which means there's more opportunity. And I do think we touched on it before, and I certainly don't want to criticize like the power brokers that came before, because I think in a lot of ways they invested in the sport because they truly loved it, and their investment benefited all of us. We got to see amazing surfing because they were investing, to Rachel's point, like they were sending young surfers around the world. They're going on the Indies Trader 4, half a dozen times before they were 16, and those generations benefited from that investment. I think, global economy being what it is, like everything is getting reset in a way that is real, but is still investing in surfing. And I go back to that point, like from my day job as a strategy person at the WSL, it's like one of the big things that we've landed inside the company in the last few years is that surfing is an ecosystem. It's made up of all these really important parts and stakeholders. There's independent voices like you guys, which are really, really important. There's the surfers themselves. There's the brands. There's the fans. There's all these different pieces. And I think if you look back over the last 10 years, there's been times where the WSL has said, we're the whole ecosystem, right? Which is the wrong way to approach it, because we actually have an awesome role within the ecosystem, which is, we exist as a platform for the world's best surfing. That's our job, right? And if we do our job right and we have good relationships with all these other elements of the broader surfing ecosystem, everyone benefits. And that's been something, the more we've focused on that, the more success we've seen. And that goes all the way back to like, it creates a more kind of fertile soil for the next generations of surfers, men or women, to go, okay, cool. There's something there for me, even if I'm not going to be a WSL surfer my whole life, even if I'm going to be a free surfer or a big wave surfer, or I'm going to be a podcaster, or I'm going to work on broadcast or a judge. Like there are avenues and there are stable career pathways and really fulfilling lives that people can follow if we all kind of do our job right,
Yeah. Yeah. I like where we're landing this conversation too. And just the perspective that it is an all around contribution of progressing. And, I think to your point, Dave, on the time of the 2000s when the endemic brands just had so much money, how that wasn't real. Or the times when WSL has tried to own the entire ecosystem. Like that's where we find, we're seeing the endemic surf brands fall over at the moment, or we haven't seen surfing exist in its best form when WSL is trying to own the entire ecosystem. And it's now moving into a space of trying to find that balance so that we have sustainability in our sport. across men's and women's surfing, across all the different disciplines there are, and resetting, like you're saying, resetting that at a space that is sustainable, and not just for surfing, but for all the avenues, or sorry, not just for competition, but for all the avenues that there are. And, all these conversations are important to that point, and in pushing it forward, and every single, it's an entire ecosystem. The media, the competition, the surfers themselves, the brands, we all live in this ecosystem, that we all want the same things, right? We're all here because we're passionate about surfing. And sometimes we can get lost in like what that end goal is. And it does feel like there is a reset happening. And I think the women surfing that we're seeing right now, and the platform that they're able to do that on, is a good example of it.
I think even just, the fact, Dave, that you're saying from the organization's perspective of the WSL that Caity Simmers is the most important surfer in the world right now. Like, she's just redefining everything. I think that is just the evidence of all of this that we've kind of been bringing to the table of that ecosystem, of that upbringing, that background, that pushing forward to where women's surfing currently is. And the fact
I should add that's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
That's
personal
not
opinion.
The official stance of the WSL is we have no favorites. I just think, like,
of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just feel like it's I think anyone within the organization, I would expect to kind of just be like, it's sort of undeniable, whether they have to state it or not. It's like, it's just an undeniable fact that Caity is the one that's like leading surfing at the moment. And that to me is the coolest thing, that we're finally at this space where an 18-year-old young woman who is the reigning world champion has just walked off of a victory in a man-made pool in the middle of the Middle East is the most important kind of conversation point maybe in our sport at the moment. And to think of the inspiration that's lending now to those next generations, to those little kids that are just starting out at board riders, still in the pushing divisions. They're not even paddling themselves in, but their mom or dad's out in the lineup and shoving them into waves. They all know who Caity is. They're all watching her stuff. And for us as, people that have been working in the industry or have been involved in this industry for so long and have seen so many of the different kind of generations come and go through it, and had our favorites do things, that we're like, there's just something that's unique that is happening right now, with so much respect to the path that's been really, I guess, given to her and given to this generation because of those that came before, is a really awesome thing for surfing as a whole.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's a great, I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but it's a great thing that we're seeing. And, I think you can't look towards the future without the massive respect of the past too, and that full understanding, and in like the I guess full understanding and respect to where surfing's already been, so we know what steps to take forward. And I think we have a healthy balance of that now, and respecting what's happened previously in women's surfing to now see where we're walking towards.
Totally.
Well, I feel like this was a pretty successful attempt at a collab for the first time for both of us on behalf of the Double Up and the lineup, in creating some sort of discussion around something that we're both quite passionate about.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. I love the podcast and I love geeking out with you. This probably could have gone for 10 hours, but maybe we'll save that for another episode. Feels like with the crop of women we have on the CT, we may have like a new favorite within months. So we'll talk about it soon.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think my favorite conversations, I mean, I have a million of these conversations just in my day-to-day life too. This is all I love to talk about, is like these thought-provoking conversations, and like challenging ourselves into, well, why do we see things this way? Or how do I see women surfing progressing versus you? And kind of challenging ourselves and thinking about it. And in this conversation, ideally, that whoever's listening, it creates that, it's a discussion starter, and it creates that discussion in their circles too. And, the more we're creating discussion around it, again, the more impact that has and flow on effect it has in terms of it being newsworthy and current. And, obviously it's important it's in its own right, but that importance is widespread and felt. And I love these. I love these conversations. It makes me think and trying to articulate and learn our opinions and form them based off of each other and bouncing off each other too.
Well, thanks again so much, Dave, for just even coming up with this plan and this idea. I'm excited to see what other podcasts you end up in that conversation with, and love the fact that you guys are just continuing to invest more in that core surfing community that's kind of been around, and we're willing to just watch any event anywhere, no matter what the conditions are like. We're not brand new to it by any means. And so I'm stoked to hear who else you guys are able to pull into some of these conversations. And yeah, Rach and I, on behalf of the Double Up, stoked to be part of this conversation today. Thanks so much to our audience. For those of you that are new to either of the communities, whether it's new to Lineup, new to the Double Up, thanks so much for tuning in today. And we hope that you will join us back again with our next episodes dropping.
Thanks.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.